I would please like to invite our guests up for a panel discussion, and they will be discussing the emerging trends and key findings on the state of management of risk management. Our first guest is one of our hosts, Nick Martin, who's head of strategic risk consulting at Marsh Advisory Pacific Marsh. Nick is experienced in defence, major events, corporate positions, risk management, and resilience consulting. Nick is also a former Royal Australian Navy clearance diver officer, and his expertise in enterprise risk management, resilience, climate sustainability, workplace health and safety, and cyber advisory makes him an outstanding fit for this panel. Our next panelist is Megan Motto. Megan is the CEO of the Governance Institute of Australia. Megan has over 20 years of experience in the association sector, and her expert in governance and risk management is absolutely quite astounding. Fellow of Governance Institute of Australia and the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Megan, it's a great pleasure to have you. And finally, wrapping up this illustrious panel is our lady disguised as a man, but actually he is representing himself on this panel, is our Group CEO, Dr. Schneider, to round out the panel. And then finally, we have our moderator, Dr. Paul Johnston, who we've seen once or twice today before as well. So Doc, over to you. Cool.
There we go. Well, last session for the day. Just before I asked some questions of our learned colleagues on the panel, we're talking about the state of risk management. I'd like to recall a comment that we actually got in one of the questions today, and they asked about Australian risk management. She'll be right. We say that a bit flippantly, but that is actually one of the concerns we do have in the risk management game. There's also a concept of saltwater risk management, where it's not going to happen here, that we're fairly safe down under, but the world is definitely changing on a variety of different levels that we've seen in terms of the nature of which problems. So I see it's a journey that we're actually on. We need to go from where we just do risk assessments, where we may get a risk score, we get a basic understanding in terms of what we're dealing with. The journey has to be ongoing to where we go to, I would say, is risk appreciation. It goes back to the comment I actually said this morning in my session, where we need to understand not just the elements there, but the interconnectedness and how they do actually, that domino effect is very real. And I still don't think we're quite there. I know I'm preaching to the converted in the room here, so it's not the best audience to try and convince them you're already there. But I think the difference is that we just can't be risk managers from now on. I think we have to be risk leaders. In fact, I know we have to be risk leaders to actually lead and facilitate that process. And of course, where are we now is the question for the day. So I'm just going to put it to my learned colleagues here on the panel in terms of, based on your experience, what are the three emerging trends you've seen or practices you've seen in risk management? You want to start?
Sure, I'll start. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I just want to reflect, if I might, on your comment before I get into my answer around the top three emerging risks that I think are really plaguing certainly boards' minds at the moment in Australia. And that is your call out for the need to become risk leaders, not just risk professionals. And I couldn't agree with you more. And I take you back to a piece of research that the Governance Institute did a couple of years ago on the future of the risk management profession. And we did some surveying. In particular, it was very pertinent because it was around the COVID time, of course, the real crisis point. And we asked whether governance professionals believed that boards were risk ready, whether the bench press strength was there in terms of not just having a nice risk framework and a matrix and all of the basics, what you'd call hygiene in place, but whether you had crisis management plans that you actually tested in real life, whether you had your scenarios and your scenario testing. And the scary thing about that study was not only by and large were those things not in place, and if they were in place, very rarely were they tested. In fact, only about a quarter of the time were they actually tested. But the differential between the board's feeling of readiness and the professionals' feeling of organised readiness had a gap of around 25%. And that's really scary because boards didn't think that they were ready, but professionals thought they were even less ready than they thought they were. And what that tells me is that boards are facing into one of the most wicked problems, and that is the worst of the unknown problems is the one that we don't know. And I think a lot of boards are still, by and large, not educated on risk management practices, risk management culture, and the types of things that you've obviously been talking about today. So I think it is incumbent upon the risk profession to step up, not just to the board, but into boards. And to become directors. We still know from our diversity index also that the Governance Institute runs that by and large we are still deriving most of the directors in Australia from legal and accounting. So where are the risk professionals that are making their way into the board seats of today? Where are the cyber professionals? Where are the HR professionals? So we need to think about diversity, not just for the purposes of whether we have ethnic diversity and gender diversity and all of those things, but we need to be thinking more deeply about the diverse skill sets that we need going forward into the future. And quite frankly, they're not necessarily a deep technical skill set, but it's the beauty of the risk and governance professionals, by the way, because we are experts at seeing across a range of different elements within our organisations and putting the glue together that looks at them in a complex way. So I just wanted to call that out because I couldn't agree more with your comment. And certainly the Governance Institute's research backs that up. In terms of the top three issues at the moment, I think that you just heard number one on top of boards' minds at the moment is definitely around ESG risk and the broad range of issues that falls under that, whether that be financial disclosures, climate change reporting, adaptation measures, geopolitical changes and how that's changing global supply chains, and broader issues around social and governance issues as well. So that's definitely something that boards are grappling with, governance professionals are grappling with, and risk professionals are grappling with, particularly around the regulatory and compliance space. ASIC, for example, is really making a huge push on greenwashing, which is scaring and testing the underlying assumptions in climate change reporting and scaring boards into what we call green hushing or green shushing, which is if you're not prepared to back your assumptions, don't say anything at all. So getting, once again, the beauty of the risk professional is getting the right balance between the technical experts that will understand all of the emissions assumptions made for your business, the adaptation assumptions, and then the financials of those, and the marketing people that want to shout to the world how good green person you are as a business, and getting that balance right. So it's very, very important that this community brings those viewpoints together. So ESG would be definitely one of them. Of course, you couldn't go for number two without mentioning cyber and all things digital and data. And it's not just around cyber and, of course, both the opportunities but the risks associated with AI now and those sorts of things. But it's also just deeply thinking about data governance. And so that's something that we're very interested in at the Governance Institute. And the third, my team put together for me some dot points, and there was sort of a mixed bag, bit of geopolitical, bit of the polycrisis, unknown unknowns, things like left field, black swan events like COVID. But I have to say, I think the biggest one is reputational risk. And so those non-financial risks can fall into a large bucket, but thinking through reputational risk, I would have to say, you think about what's going through Alan Joyce's mind today and the board of Qantas. Reputational risk trumps almost everything else in terms of being the most difficult, complex, wicked problem to manage, because nearly everything else is complicated, but not quite as complex as what happens in these days of immediacy of social media.
And if I could just say, I think reputation risk, actually, you wouldn't say, it actually underpins those first two that you mentioned.
Absolutely.
I think that's the glue that can either be an opportunity or it can be a devastating risk exposure for an organisation. So, very much so.
Let me go next. They're the on the risk side, absolutely agree with what you said, Megan. The one that I'm finding that's standing out, which doesn't get talked about a hell of a lot, is the individual resilience around people. It's sort of almost taken as a given that we'll just deal with what we've got in front of us and we'll move on and be better and stronger for it. Interestingly enough, though, I think, and Australia in particular, I think has been impacted by this, because if you think back prior to 2019, anyone who's had their corporate career in Australia, grown up in Australia, it's been reasonably benign, like natural weather events aside. We deal with those. All the risk is quite linear. The risk process that we use to manage is just the quarterly board cycle. You put your risks up, the board rubber stamps it, and then the audit team might roll around every now and again and check up on some of your control effectiveness. But what's happened since 2019, if you think about it, we've culturally had a massive shift. So we had the bushfires, which rolled into COVID, which then rolled into floods at the end of the year. And then we had a conflict in the Ukraine. And then we had China remaining in lockdown, which had a significant impact on supply chain. And then we had the Ukraine conflict, which had significant impact on the agricultural industry. So, and that none of those finished before the next one started. So you had this really unique situation, I think, where all this was compounding. And then you've got these macro level issues happening around the globe, whether it's cyber or whether, we had a whole lot of cyber events occurring too, as you know, on top of what I've just mentioned. And then you have the climate and sustainability aspects which are occurring and seem like insurmountable. How do we actually control that as individuals? So I think all that compounding together has had I'm actually, when I say at a human level, I'm talking about not only society, but in boards and executive teams. It's actually quite noticeable now when you go in and do a resilience activity with them, that a lot of them are really lost for answers, and they're lost in the sense that they don't have the capacity to deal with what they're being challenged with. So I think a human resilience piece to me works both ways. How do we prepare people to deal with what's coming and what's currently here? But also at the same time, recognise that's a risk to your business. And I actually think you're seeing that in part of the churn and the move out of business of the people. They're going, I can't handle the pressure. I can't deal with what's in front of me. I need to retreat, recharge before I come back in again. So that's my answer to that. I can get into the whole risk piece as well, but I'll give Gab some airtime.
Oh, and I'm just going to comment on that. I mean, that's fueled also by 25 years of continuous economic growth, which means there's been no policy losers really in the Australian landscape for the last 25 years. No policy losers on your government policy. And the other thing is, a generation where everyone gets a prize.
So, sorry, I just want to jump in first, Gab. Sorry, I don't get an opportunity to jump on the CEO very often. Just in terms of comment about the personal risk, it's a term I've heard used a few times, is risk fatigue. I think it's very true. And you also use the phrase personal resilience. And I must admit, when I hear the word resilience now, and it shouldn't, but it gives me a real facial tick. Because I think it's been overused. And I'll explain why. There was a federal statutory authority I would love to mention, but probably isn't appropriate to do it here, that we were dealing with some leadership, risk of leadership and culture development. And the senior leadership team kept saying our staff are resilient. They're incredibly resilient. That's all I heard. When I started to talk to the frontline staff, what they meant to say was they were numb. They were used to being broken. And they were just bouncing back to here we go again. It was literally Groundhog Day. So I think that's a really critical point that we don't address enough, is that sense of personal resilience. And we were discussing it actually during the break. We don't have to de-stress, we have to decompress. I think that's one of the big issues that we have to have moving forward. So,
well, those who know me won't often have seen me say what they said, but what they said, yes. But a couple of other things to add around the key trending. And I think the question was around key trending around risk management. Risk management, so-called, had its heyday through COVID, where risk managers had to take on resilience and do everything and jump in, save the day if they were allowed to. And pragmatically, I don't think we've actually dealt with this COVID hangover. You addressed that as personal fatigue, but I'm seeing that in our clients. I'm seeing that in people we talk to. Things are sluggish. Organizations are not making decisions. They're leaning back on bureaucracy as an excuse for not making decisions. But equally so, we definitely don't see the action we saw pre-COVID, and we don't see the drive we saw pre-COVID. And bureaucracy seems to be a good excuse for that, or busyness, both in equal parts, which neither get things done. Being overly busy or broken don't help. I think the other piece, we've fallen back in, and I think Lynn, you raised this morning around compliance as a risk in itself. We're seeing the confusion of compliance with risk management. I've been doing this for 20 years odd. I've never seen so many clients confuse the two and continually put things in front of us going, we have to improve our risk management, we have to improve this, we have to improve that. And you look back, all they're talking about is we want to do more 5x5 matrices, or we want to buy another software tool that will help us do some sort of quantification. I see lots of lip service around building humans and being human-centric. I see very little action around building humans and being human-centric. And to the point around risk leadership, we don't magically make leaders. So how do we transition the risk manager into a risk leader? Well, we have to have people that will follow them, but we also have to have people that people want to follow. And I think we've got a severe problem that we don't actually necessarily have enough resilience. People are tired, we don't have enough capacity, and we're confusing this with compliance. So I'm counting to see that I got 3. But realistically, we're in a good place in that risk management has a seat at the table it never had pre-COVID. We're not in the best place because we're not capitalizing on what they could do for organizations.
Well, you just segue to with another question. How well placed do you think organisations are to deal with these issues? I know you've already touched upon it. What actually needs to change at both that macro and that micro level?
Oh, look, I'll jump in next. And at danger of being one of those panels that says, yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree, and I might just explain it from my perspective, just from a slightly nuanced approach. I also don't really follow the AFL, so I have that in common with you. But I think functionally, organisations, the development of the risk management industry has been phenomenal over the last decade, even more so, and so that's been really exciting to watch. And I think that there is a much broader understanding, particularly with cases like STAR coming to light and the need for boards to reach in and own risk in organisations. I think that that's definitely helped. So I think structurally organisations know that they have to have a risk management function. They know that there has to functionally marry up through the risk management committee of the board and up to the board. They have to have the right frameworks in place, and by and large those things are happening. What worries me is the confusion between risk and compliance, and you mentioned it before, Gav. Funnily enough, I talk about governance and risk quite a lot. And when I'm speaking to audiences about risk, I use the analogy of a trapeze artist. And trapeze artists train with harnesses on. And I say to people, why is there a harness? And, people say, so that they don't hurt themselves and they don't fall to the ground to their, bloody death and all the disaster scenarios occur. And I said that's actually none of those reasons is the reason why we wear a harness. Because if the aim of the game is to be safe, best way to be safe, don't get up on the trapeze. The reason they wear the harness is so they can take more risk, so that they can try more difficult things. And this is where the confusion between governance being a framework for compliance and just being regulated by the whole bunch of rules that others create for you completely disregards the performance elements of why you do risk management. And it's actually to take more risk. Even Joe Longo of ASIC says the rule of thumb is that the corporate sector should be taking risk. Now, this is the regulator encouraging the private sector to take risk. And that's the reason that we have the controls in place and the conversations that occur. So I think at one level, organisations functionally are getting a lot more prepared. They've got the right individuals with the right skill sets doing the right things. But I think some of the conversations are still very immature when it comes to how we manage risk. And the other piece around that is the complexity between risk appetite statement and risk tolerance. Most boards, for example, will say, we'll have a really big risk appetite for, commercial products. And then the first time something goes wrong, they slap everyone on the wrist and they say, everyone, you can't get your short-term incentive this year because that went wrong and there was a financial component to that. And so the sentiment and the actuality are mismatched in organisations. And that takes me to my third point, and that's really about deep culture and about risk culture. Interestingly, in organisations, and I saw it happen with HR and I've seen it happen with marketing, the moment that there is a professional with the title in the company, everyone else says, thank God someone else is managing risk now. I don't have to do it anymore. You know, you think about HR function in your organisations. Oh, thank God the HR, I don't have to have those tricky staff conversations anymore. Got a HR manager now, off they go to HR. Risk is everyone's job. HR is everyone's job. Marketing is everyone's job. So it's really important that the risk component in an organisation isn't seen to be a silo that does it on its own. It's actually a leadership silo that encourages and promotes risk culture and risk understanding throughout the organisation. So I think a lot of organisations are a little bit less sophisticated than they should be, because the elevation of the people element of risk and the culture is quite not there.
Totally agree with both of you. Again, it's easy for me. I guess one of the challenges, so Megan, you spoke about the board level, and Nick, you spoke about what you were seeing also sort of in the ASX listed reporting cycle. I'll probably take the other view and I'll talk about what we're seeing lower down. And I think this is the challenge. We've got wonderful tools. Like if I look at where risk management's gone in the last 15 years, we've gone from a 5x5 matrix that nobody understood except a few nerdy people like me, and thought it was pretty cool, to risk appetite statements, tolerance discussions. We've actually started to see risk as part of strategy now. I say started because that's still a big challenge we've got, where most risk departments and risk experts are not part of the strategy setting component. But what we are seeing down the food chain, and you explained it really well, Megan, is that piece where, because we've got a function that says risk management, we don't think other people are responsible, accountable, etc. as this goes. It's absolutely contradictory and creates a cognitive dissonance within these organizations, who might have board directors and people at the top who are going, we have to be agile, we have to be resilient, we have to be able to adapt and grab opportunity. And then one step down, people go, how? What do you mean? All our policies, procedures, and structures don't allow us to do it. So we see this cognitive dissonance between sentiment and action. So if we're going to be able to change that, to your point, we've got to do things a little bit differently. But I'm quite excited, to be honest. I actually think we're tracking in a pretty good way and a pretty good pace. And these are growing pains. And even though we had some bad news kind of indicators earlier this morning, whether AI takes over the world or not, either which way, for the foreseeable future, let's call it 10 to 20 years, we've got a lot of work to do. And risk is a skill. And I wish we were teaching it to our kids in a slightly better way, so that they could take calculated risks, and we'll grow up to be able to not feel that compliance is the driver, but opportunity centrism is probably the driver. And I think that's a great place that we're sitting in. It's not a bad place we're in compared to where we were.
Just a couple of points. To Megan's point, you said that we have seen a lot of development in risk management. I think we have, but that silo is still definitely there. The magic title, the hero myth, if you like. I think organisations have focused so much, and excuse my language, they focus so much on covering their arse, they've actually forgotten to protect it. And they're very exposed with a sense of invincibility is just not there. And to take Gab's point in terms of we have to be teaching our children risk, I think we're going the other way. They're not allowed to climb trees, they're not allowed to do this, not allowed to do that. That risk tolerance or risk appetite is taught from an early age. And not to be too flippant, but when I was their age, you're 4 or 5, you fall out of a tree, you bounce back. I fall down, I lie in a heap groaning until someone picks me up.
And you shouldn't be climbing trees at your age, mate.
51 is
Keep climbing trees.
Thank you very much. I knew I liked you for a reason.
Keep climbing trees.
But the concepts are sound in terms of that, it's just not there. So, but I think we're on that developmental journey, as I mentioned earlier, from risk assessment to real appreciation, and we're not quite there yet. But just the last question for the day before I open it up to general questions, and any final comments, is what role do you see industry is having in addressing these wicked problems that we've been discussing today?
I might start with that one. To be honest, I think the risk vocation should be owning the area of wicked problems. We are best equipped when you actually look at how we have methodologies to gather information, assess that information, rate that information, and determine appropriate courses of action. So I think it's a space that risk management tends to want to own, but get forced into risk-based compliance as the driver, as opposed to opportunity centrism. Because every wicked problem is an opportunity too. It's not just a problem. So I think that's probably one of the stumbling blocks we've got to work to overcome, is the language we think about and talk about risk. But realistically, we are tracking in the right direction. And I still am befuddled, to be honest, to your point around resilience earlier. I did a few keynotes through COVID for the Global Business Continuity Institute. And the brief 3 times in a row was, we are the custodians of business resilience. We do business impact assessments. We do business continuity planning. My people are so confused because none of them own resilience. And who owns resilience? It's the same thing. Who owns risk? Well, I'd say the other point is, we need to stop this ownership piece, and we need to all pull in the same direction. That takes culture. And I'm almost embarrassed to say this, that a few times when we've been brought in to do risk culture work for ASX and APRA regulated entities, it's just risk compliance. There's really no cultural element there, which is really sad. So, I think, Megan, to your point that there are regulators who are wanting to see risk in practice, so we grow. I think the other challenge we've got is we've got other regulators who are still probably stuck a little bit in, the more regulation we put on you, the more compliance we put on you, the more control we have. And it's a fallacy based on complexity and chaos. But I overall think it's a good news message.
I thought quite a bit. Once again, my team wrote some notes, and they're all very good notes, by the way. But I thought a lot about this last question, about what can the industry really do to shift the dial. And once again, I can talk about some of the more standard answers, but I think the real answer lies in the courage to be disruptive. Because, and I'll explain this. I used to work with the engineering sector in another lifetime, and we were talking about, in engineering projects, big infrastructure projects, roads, bridges, etc., the difference between complex problems and complicated problems, large projects, large complicated projects versus wicked projects, mega projects. And the answer lies in the human element, in the people element. Our technical knowledge in engineering is well advanced. We have, these cost-benefit analysis. I mean, part of that's about perverse incentives to get the wrong answer in the first place, but let's move beyond that. The reality is we don't have optimism bias. We're very realistic. Anyone who has ever met an engineer or knows an engineer knows they don't innately have optimism bias. What we're not very good at is managing the multiplicity of stakeholder relationships. I only caught the tail end of the previous speaker, but the stakeholder mapping piece is so instrumental in wicked problems, because there is no problem in society that any one aspect of society, any one company will solve by itself. Whether it's a political problem, whether it's an industry-led problem, whether it's a consumer problem, we are going to have to work collaboratively to do it. And that means complex stakeholder relationships. But that means that we need to disrupt what is the status quo, and that is the thinking of the norm, which is this type of person will solve this problem, this type of organisation will solve this problem. And so you see it when you have big extreme events, and you talked about the more complex the event, it actually goes downwards, because the more the catastrophic nature of the event, the more risk averse and revert to type we become. So we actually go backwards in our capacity to evolve and think innovatively and really create new meaning out of new situations. So I think disrupting legislation, disrupting the regulatory barriers, disrupting the status quo of the thinking, and being brave enough to have those conversations. When disaster occurs, everyone wants to minimise risk. Leaning into it is the answer, not retreating. Risk management is actually about leaning into risk, not about leaning away from it.
A very good point. It's about, to go back to the definition, exploring opportunities whilst managing adverse effects, not just managing adverse effects.
Exactly.
Nicholas?
I agree with you both. I think in my mind, I'm going to, it's not the David Farney fan club here, but but if you think about the national coordination mechanism and COVID, now I know COVID wasn't a crisis and that was a sort of a shared experience for everyone, but the role of risk in that was quite interesting for me, watching how the risk function actually ended up facilitating dealing with the COVID disruption. Now, go with me on that. So risk managers by nature are facilitators. They bring people together from different groups, different levels in the organisation, trying to facilitate a discussion around what are the risks that we're facing. They try and articulate that in a way that allows businesses to make decisions and move forward. Now, COVID was unreal for that because the risk managers in the organisation I was at the time, we were able to actually take control of the COVID response and bring risk to life actually in the decision making. And what was quite fascinating for me was the execs didn't have all the information all the time, but was still prepared to make decisions. It was like to your point, Megan, about dropping all the compliance and all the different rules and regulations you're meant to be abiding to. They pushed it all to the side and said, unless it's illegal, or we're going to go forward. And the risk team took the front line on that. And that went for a long time. That went on for like nearly 2 years in reality by the time this was working through. So that was happening at organisational level. And then what ended up happening was the risk managers were sharing information because we get asked the question, well, what's Woolworths doing? What's Qantas doing? And we'd be able to reach out, we'd collaborate, look at what was happening, what was reasonable, and then we'd start sharing that through our executive team. So then you found that society was starting to calibrate, and then through the coordination mechanism, then we were participating in that and sharing and collaborating. So in all, it was basically risk facilitating discussions and outcomes, positions, bringing it together in an unstructured way. So that's, in my mind, I think the role of risk really, if you reflect back to COVID, and I think we were talking about before, that no one's ever done a post-COVID review. No one's ever done it, stopped and reviewed it. Any other crisis, you'd have a post-incident review and reflect on what worked well, not worked well, and then try and move forward. Never done that with COVID. We just got on with it. So in my mind, I think COVID's a great lesson. I think there's a lot of little nuggets in there that we can take and improve the risk functions.
A quick note of that, we actually did do several post-COVID reviews for clients, and just out of interest, most of them were buried internally within the clients who paid us to do them,
Wow.
which is really, really scary. And I'd probably say in the majority of those, the superstars, the Nicks of this world who collaborated and pulled people together, left those organizations, and we took all that knowledge with them. So we're actually seeing in practice now, most of these organizations are significantly more vulnerable than they were before. And even the ones who did the reviews have buried the reviews, mainly because they didn't show the best light of that organization at the start. But usually, I'll probably say almost all of them, you did some of them, by the end, they were doing really well. And they'd actually developed everything you said, agility, collaboration in practice.
We're going to continue to take over on this. We'll have a chat. But the interesting thing, and you mentioned it, the organisations that did really well in COVID, and we knew that we knew as a community that most organisations either didn't have a pandemic on the risk register or might have said it was so rare they'd never tested any scenarios. The organisations that did well were not the ones that went stuck with a compliance mindset, but they were the ones that were driven by principle. And that is culture. That comes back to risk culture and culture in organisations and how important culture is, because those organisations that said, oh, forget about knowing where all the technology is. Everyone get in a cab, come in, take a monitor, take a chair, take a keyboard, go home, and we'll figure it out later. Now, that's driven by principle. That's not what would be in your policy. I'm sure that your IT department would not write that into a policy, but that is the power of culture.
Just on that, it's interesting, just to add to Gav's comments, so we did a number of reviews for organisations, and what we found was either it was edited and bleached to a point that was a waste of time, or the lessons learned have been shelved and they want all the staff back in the office. All that agility has been lost. It's amazing. And I have to apologise. We do have a number of questions that we've actually run out of time, just in the interest of keeping everything on track. So if we could just ask, if you can, I know it's a lovely chatty group here. I'd like for a 30-second snapshot just to close up, if you so wish.
I think I've said my piece. I'll
Yeah.
take it all to the end.
I think I have too.
Oh, there you go. Don't hear that very much from risk people. Okay. Well, thank you very much. A round of applause for the.
So if you indulge me, I know I'm standing in the way between beers and drinks and things like that, but if you indulge me, I'm going to take an MC license for 2 minutes. We're going to play a bit of a game. While we play a bit of a game, Janita's just going to get the game ready. Everyone likes a game and everyone likes fun, and it's going to be productive, and it's going to take 2 minutes out of your time. So while Janita's just busy taking that, I just want to, before we ask Ben and Gav to close off for us, I just really want to extend our gratitude and appreciation to Marsh and their catering team. They've done an outstanding job today, always making sure that we're well fed. The hosts have been absolutely, the AV team at the back, the marketing team, they've really made us all feel welcome and warm and fuzzy. So just to express our gratitude to Marsh and the technical team, the marketing team, and the catering team as well for that. And then just before we play the game in 1 second, I want to finish off, and it touches on Megan's point that you raised earlier. To quote our good friend Hamish Hansford, and we've captured this quote of his and we really like it. Failure of imagination. We must always challenge our imagination to make sure we don't fail, potentially catastrophically. I think that's fantastic. So now what I'm going to ask you to do is, just before Gav and Ben close up, I'm going to switch back. I'm going to ask you to please scan that QR code. I'm not going to take your details. I'm not going to ask you to log into anything. I'm not going to ask you to give your credit card details unless you want to, but I'm not going to ask you to do any of that. And I'm going to ask you to please write down the words that come to your mind when you think about what are the key words that encapsulate your main takeaways from today. Just the first word. Jot it down and it's going to pop up on the board so we can all share it. Your name won't come up, so don't worry. You can say nothing. And your name won't come up from it either. Once typing, communication. Holistic. Risk. That's interesting. Wisdom, culture, right holders. Leon. Silos. Sausage rolls. Communication, connected. Collaboration. Great sausage rolls. I agree. Interdependencies. Future. Collaboration and culture. Those are the two that pop up. Brilliant. Human elements. Awesome. I love that one. You get an extra beer tonight. Dynamic, holistic. Right. Now if we scroll to the next one, the next one is going to ask you, what are you going to do about it? So now you're all inspired. The second you commit to it, you action it. So what is the one key takeaway that you're going to walk away from today with, based on what you thought of today? If it's up, I don't know who you are, but if it's up, you have to commit. Continue to disrupt. I love that. That's great. I love disruption. Read more, refocus, conversation. Beer. Okay, fine. Is that telling me to shut up and get off? Right, fair enough. Coffee, all right, fair enough. Work on culture, read more AI, building connections, refocus. Brilliant. Okay, fine. I'm glad. We're going to Gav to close off the day for us.
Oh, well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone that's been following us online today. Thank you very much to the ISRM and Risk to Solution. It was a real pleasure today. I think that in the room, we had collectively a lot of intellectual firepower when it came to risk and the ability to cover off quite a range of areas. I think sometimes the challenge for people that work in risk is that they need to be experts in a little bit of everything. They need to be talking geopolitics 1 minute and cyber the next and supply chain the next. So as with everything, as we always talk to our clients, there's never really a finish line when it comes to risk management, isn't there? It's always just sort of trying to progress and push that needle further. And as we try to do is to try to keep ahead of risk. How Marsh try to keep ahead of risk is that we do a few things. We like to collaborate. So on things like this, we collaborate with insurers around the world, we collaborate with our clients, and we collaborate with partners and academia. And what we try to do is to foster a risk community where we can consistently push that needle forward. So for those of you today that have just been introduced to Marsh, haven't been don't know us, please follow us on Marsh Australia, I think, on LinkedIn. There's quite a lot. I think that globally we invest hundreds of millions of dollars into research, into risk management. So there's quite a lot of areas where and as we've discussed today, where we work on everything from challenges with the Ukraine to emergency response efforts in the UK and the US. How else we can work with you? Well, we've got about 85,000 employees. In Australia, we've got about 2/3 of the ASX, 8 out of 10 of the ASX 10, 450 councils, 15,000 clients. And with those clients, and as Nick mentioned, also a lot of sporting organisations, we place insurance and we advise them on risk. So what we hope to be is the intermediary between some of these organisations and yourselves to be able to share ideas, to sort of learn in terms of what best practices are. And the final thing I think that we can work with you all on is our data. There's an incredible amount of data. We talk about the importance to quantify risk and not just describe risk. So sometimes insurance has a way of cutting through things. So we get underwriting information. We have claims data. We've got some of the largest programs to be able to track in real time the impacts of controls on cyber risk and what really is that magic mix. We are able to track in real time the impacts of people's impacts on property risks. So please continue this conversation with us. I'd like to thank you all. Hopefully this is the first time and we can come back soon and continue this discussion. So thank you on behalf of Marsh. Thank you, everyone.
I've totally taken the not so subtle hint that beer is more important than us. So point noted. A few thanks. Dave, thank you. In case you forgot, Dave actually stood in for Leanne today and spent last night prepping to get ready. So if you just join me in giving him a thanks. The events team, Janita, Cherry, the Marsh team, no event happens automatically. There's lots of pieces that come together to make that happen. So if you wouldn't mind joining me in thanking them. Speakers, thank you for donating your time, your expertise, sharing your knowledge so kindly and generously. I really do think we are in a stage of human evolution where holding on to knowledge only hurts us. And we are at a stage now where we've got to be giving, sharing, and collaborating. And if you're wrong, that's okay. It's a wicked problem. We probably don't have all the answers. So if you're wrong, at least we're starting to solve the problem. I'd also like to extend the thanks to David Rubens, Dr. David Rubens, who founded the ISRM. He had a pretty nasty flight over from the UK and managed to fight the jet lag and still wow us. So David, thank you. This is not necessarily a strong arm tactic or anything else. I am a fellow of the ISRM, fellow of the Governance Institute, RMIA's Risk Leader of the Year. I think it was Jason Brown who coined the term FUMU, fear of missing out on organizations. Okay, so he's not alone. But you've got to belong to a fraternity. And I'd urge you, if you don't belong to an association that enables you to talk about some of these strategic pieces, you're missing out on the opportunity to make yourself better and be better for your organization. It doesn't matter, honestly, which one, but you've got to pick some place to collaborate, share, and grow. So with that in mind, this is definitely not the last time. We've now formally launched the ISRM Center for the Study of Wicked Problems. If you want to get involved, it's really, really easy. You don't even have to be an ISRM member. You can just share. We've got the journal coming up. Hit up Paul. He does edit it. So if you want to get published, this is your perfect opportunity to hit up the editor and make sure your article is in. But please help us to continue this discussion. I think the challenge we fundamentally got is we are trying to shift the dial based from lineal compliance-based thinking to going, that's fine. We still want that because some of the things we deal with are simple and complicated, but we need a different skill set that incorporates complexity and chaotic environments as well. And that's more of a leadership and an emotive trust-based methodology for doing business. We want both. So, that's something we can't achieve alone. Help us to help you, to help everyone else, to get the message out there. And if you give yourself a round of applause for being such excellent participants and online, thank you, Cara, has already shared some love online. I think we forget that there's 50 people or so online too. But give yourselves a round of applause and join us for a beer shortly.